The black waiter held the broken plate. The manager pulled him aside. "You're nothing but a waste of good air. And everybody in this room knows it." The words hit Jamal Thompson like a punch to the chest as he stood beside table 14 at the Silver Spoon, one of the finest restaurants in Memphis, Tennessee, holding a tray of appetizers that suddenly felt as heavy as his heart. The man who spoke was Gregory Warren, a 62-year-old real estate developer who came in every Friday night wearing suits that cost more than Jamal made in 2 months, and who had made it his personal mission to remind Jamal of every limitation society had ever tried to place on young black men. Jamal was 22 years old, tall and lean with his father's strong jaw and his mother's gentle eyes, and he had been working at this restaurant for 3 years now, ever since he graduated high school and needed to help his mother pay for the cancer treatments that were slowly eating away at their savings and their hope. He forced his face to remain neutral, forced his hands to stay steady, forced himself to remember why he was here, why he needed this job, why he couldn't afford to let this man see him break. His mother, Denise, was back home right now, probably sitting in her favorite chair by the window, probably thinking about him and praying that tonight would be a good night, and Jamal would not go home with stories that made her worrying more than she already did. So he took a breath, the way she had taught him, and he let the insult pass through him like wind through an open window, there and then gone, leaving nothing behind but the faint memory of its passing. "Your appetizers, sir," Jamal said, his voice professional and calm as he began placing the plates on the table with the precision that had earned him the respect of every chef in the kitchen. Warren's wife, a woman named Patricia who always looked at Jamal with apologetic eyes, shifted uncomfortably in her seat and studied her napkin as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Across from her sat their son, Tyler, a young man, about Jamal's age, who worked at his father's company and who seemed to carry the weight of his father's cruelty like a burden he had never asked for. The fourth seat held Margaret Chen, a local businesswoman who was discussing some kind of partnership deal with Warren, and her expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing of what she thought about the scene unfolding before her. Jamal had learned to read people in this job, had learned to notice the small details that told him who was dangerous and who was simply damaged, and he could see that Margaret was watching Warren the way a scientist watches a specimen, gathering data, making calculations. Warren picked up his fork and poked at the crab cake as if it had personally offended him, and Jamal knew what was coming next, because this was a dance they had performed many times before. "This is cold," Warren announced, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, even though Jamal had watched the chef plate it moments ago, steam still rising from the delicate crust. Jamal didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't defend himself, because he had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, at least not in public, at least not when your mother's medicine cost $400 a month and your sister was counting on you to help her through nursing school. "I apologize, sir," he said, reaching for the plate. "Let me have the kitchen prepare a fresh one immediately." But as his hand moved toward the dish, Warren's arm swept across the table in what would later be described as an accidental gesture, knocking the tray from Jamal's other hand and sending 3 plates of food crashing to the polished hardwood floor. The sound was like a small explosion in the elegant dining room, and every head turned toward the chaos of shattered porcelain and scattered food that now surrounded Jamal's feet. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, and Jamal felt every eye in the restaurant boring into him, felt the weight of their assumptions pressing down on his shoulders, felt the familiar shame of being judged for something that wasn't his fault, but would somehow become his responsibility anyway. Warren leaned back in his chair with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and his voice carried across the silent room as he said, "Well, that was clumsy, wasn't it? I certainly hope you're not expecting me to pay for your mistakes." Patricia closed her eyes as if she was praying or wishing herself somewhere else, and Tyler stared at his father with an expression that hovered somewhere between disgust and resignation. Jamal dropped to his knees immediately, beginning to gather the broken pieces with hands that trembled slightly despite his best efforts to control them, and he felt the sharp edge of a plate slice into his palm, but he didn't stop, didn't react, didn't give Warren the satisfaction of seeing him in pain. A busboy named Carlos rushed over to help, whispering in Spanish that Warren was a demon in an expensive suit, and Jamal would have smiled if he wasn't so focused on holding himself together. The blood from his cut hand mixed with the cream sauce on the floor, creating a pattern that looked almost artistic in its randomness, and Jamal thought about how strange it was that something so painful could create something almost beautiful. He was still on his knees when he heard the footsteps approaching, measured and deliberate, and he looked up to see Robert Chen, the restaurant's general manager, standing above him with an expression that Jamal couldn't quite read. Robert was a man in his mid-40s, Asian American, with gray streaking his black hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of long nights and heavy thoughts. He had been the manager here for almost 2 years now, and in all that time, Jamal had never been able to figure him out. Robert was always watching, always present, always seeming to know things before they happened, and there was something in the way he looked at Jamal sometimes that felt almost familiar, like a half-remembered dream. "Jamal," Robert said, his voice quiet but carrying the kind of authority that made people stop and listen. "Come with me to my office." Now, the walk through the restaurant felt like the longest journey of Jamal's life, past the staring diners, and the whispering staff and the kitchen door where the cooks had gathered to watch another worker fall victim to the cruel game that people like Warren played without consequence. Jamal kept his head up because his mother had taught him that dignity was the one thing nobody could take unless you gave it away. But inside, he was already calculating how many job applications he would need to fill out tomorrow, already wondering how he would explain to his sister Kaisha that he couldn't help with her tuition this semester after all. Robert's office was at the back of the restaurant, a small room with a window that looked out onto the alley where delivery trucks came and went. And as Jamal stepped inside, he noticed for the first time the photographs on the wall. There were pictures of Robert with various staff members over the years, pictures of restaurant events and charity functions, but one photograph in particular caught Jamal's attention. It showed two young men in work uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of a factory that Jamal didn't recognize, but that stirred something deep in his memory anyway. One of the men was clearly a younger Robert, perhaps 20 years ago, and the other was a black man with a strong jaw and gentle eyes, and Jamal felt his breath catch in his throat because he knew that face. He had seen it in his mother's wedding album. He had seen it in the single photograph she kept on her knit stand. He had seen it in the mirror every morning of his life. "That's my father," Jamal whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them, and he turned to look at Robert with new eyes, with confusion and hope and fear all tangled together in his chest. Robert closed the door softly and walked to his desk, but instead of sitting behind it, he stood beside Jamal, both of them facing the photograph as if it were a window into another time. "Marcus Thompson," Robert said, and his voice was thick with emotion that Jamal had never heard from him before. "The best friend I ever had, the bravest man I ever knew. And yes, Jamal, your father." Jamal felt his legs weaken, felt the room spin slightly, felt 22 years of unanswered questions suddenly demanding attention all at once. His whole life, he had been told that his father abandoned them when Jamal was 5 years old, had been told that Marcus Thompson was a coward who couldn't handle the responsibility of a family, had grown up with the shame and anger that comes from being left behind by someone who was supposed to love you. His mother never talked about it, would change the subject whenever Jamal asked, would get a look in her eyes that was equal parts sadness and something else, something Jamal had never been able to name until this moment. "I don't understand," Jamal said, and his voice sounded like a stranger's, young and lost and desperate for answers. "My mother said he left," she said. He just walked away one day and never came back. Robert reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder that looked old and worn, as if it had been opened and closed thousands of times over the years, and he handed it to Jamal with hands that weren't quite steady. "Your mother told you what she thought would hurt you less," Robert said softly. "She told you a lie because the truth was too painful for a child to understand, and then too many years had passed to change the story." Inside the folder, Jamal found newspaper clippings, official reports, letters, and photographs that told a story he had never known. 20 years ago, Robert and Marcus had worked together at a chemical plant outside Memphis, two young men from different backgrounds who had become brothers in everything but blood. One night, there was an accident, a fire that started in the storage facility and spread faster than anyone expected. Robert had been trapped inside, unconscious from smoke, seconds away from death, when Marcus ran into the burning building against everyone's orders. The articles called Marcus a hero, described how he carried Robert to safety and then went back for another worker who was still inside. The building collapsed before Marcus could escape, and he died saving a man named Jerome Williams, a father of 3 who went on to become a firefighter and who still visited Marcus's grave every year. Jamal's hands were shaking so badly that the papers rattled like leaves in a storm, and tears were falling onto the newsprint, blurring words that had already blurred his entire understanding of his own life. "Your mother didn't want you to grow up in the shadow of a tragedy," Robert continued, and now there were tears in his eyes too, tears that had been waiting 20 years for permission to fall. "She didn't want you to carry the weight of being the son of a dead hero, didn't want every teacher and neighbor and stranger to look at you with pity instead of seeing who you really were. So she created a different story, a story where your father was simply gone, where you could be angry instead of grieving, where you could move forward without always looking back." Jamal thought about all the years he had spent hating a ghost, all the nights he had lain awake wondering what he had done wrong to make his father leave, all the times he had sworn to himself that he would never be like Marcus Thompson, never abandon the people who needed him. And now he learned that Marcus Thompson had been the opposite of everything Jamal had believed, had been a man who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away, had given his life so that others could live. "I owed your father everything," Robert said, his voice breaking slightly. "He saved my life, and he died doing it, and there was nothing I could do to repay that debt except to watch over the family he left behind." The pieces were coming together now, fitting into place like a puzzle that Jamal had been trying to solve his entire life without knowing what the picture was supposed to look like. Robert explained how he had kept track of the Thompson family over the years, how he had anonymously paid off their house when Jamal was 12, how he had set up the scholarship fund that was helping Kaisha through nursing school, how he had taken this job specifically because he knew Jamal worked here and wanted to be close enough to protect him. "The anonymous donor," Jamal whispered, remembering how his mother had cried when she received the letter saying her mortgage was paid in full, remembering how she had called it a miracle and thanked God for sending angels when they needed them most. "That was you." Robert nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted, became harder and more determined. "But there's something else you need to know, Jamal, something about Gregory Warren." He turned to his computer and pulled up security footage from the dining room, footage that clearly showed Warren deliberately knocking the tray from Jamal's hands, footage that proved what had happened was assault, not accident. "Gregory Warren and my father had a business rivalry 30 years ago," Robert explained. "Warren destroyed my father's company through lies and manipulation, drove him to bankruptcy and nearly to suicide. When Warren found out I was managing this restaurant, he started coming in specifically to cause problems, specifically to torment the staff I tried to protect. And when he realized how much I watched over you in particular, he made you his favorite target." The hatred Jamal felt toward Warren was shifting now, becoming something more complex, becoming part of a larger story that connected the families across decades of pain and resilience. "I've been building a case against Warren for 2 years," Robert continued, and now his voice was steady and strong. the voice of a man who had been planning for this moment. Tax fraud, bribery, discrimination against employees at his own company. Tonight's footage is the final piece, proof of physical assault that will open the door to everything else. He showed Jamal emails from former employees willing to testify, financial records that Warren's accountant had secretly copied, contracts that proved illegal dealings with city officials. By Monday morning, Robert explained, all of this would be delivered to the district attorney's office, and Gregory Warren would be facing charges that could put him in prison for years. Your father spent his last moments saving people who deserve to live, Robert said, looking at Jamal with eyes full of something that might have been pride. I've spent the last 20 years trying to be worthy of that sacrifice, trying to save people in smaller ways, trying to make sure that men like Warren can't keep hurting people like you. Jamal looked at the photograph on the wall again, looked at his father's young face, and for the first time in his life, he felt not shame but pride flowing through his veins. Pride in sharing blood with a man who had run into fire when everyone else ran away. The next few weeks moved like a river finally released from a dam, fast and powerful and full of changes that Jamal could barely process. Gregory Warren was arrested on charges of assault, fraud, and bribery, and the news coverage revealed decades of cruelty that he had hidden behind his expensive suits and his charitable donations. Patricia Warren filed for divorce and made a public statement apologizing to every employee her husband had ever mistreated. And Tyler Warren donated his trust fund to organizations fighting workplace discrimination. The Silver Spoon became famous not for scandal, but for integrity. And Robert gave interviews about the importance of protecting workers from abuse, never once mentioning his personal connection to Jamal or the debt he had been paying for 20 years. Jamal told his mother everything, held her as she cried tears that had been waiting 2 decades to fall, and together they visited his father's grave for the first time since the funeral that 5-year-old Jamal had been too young to understand. Kaisha came too, and Robert, and they stood together in the Memphis sunshine while Denise finally told her children the true story of their father's last day. The day he kissed her goodbye and went to work and never came home because he couldn't walk past someone who needed help without stopping to offer it. 6 months later, Jamal stood at a podium in the Memphis Community Center, wearing a suit that Robert had bought him, preparing to give a speech at the dedication of the Marcus Thompson Memorial Scholarship Fund. In the audience sat his mother and sister, Robert and his wife, Jerome Williams and his now-grown children, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by Marcus's sacrifice or by the ripples that spread from it over the years. Behind Jamal was a large photograph of his father, the same image from Robert's office wall, and looking at it no longer brought pain, but instead a sense of connection that Jamal had been missing his entire life. He spoke about his father, about Robert, about the lies we tell to protect people, and the truth that eventually sets everyone free. He spoke about the broken plates on the restaurant floor and the broken assumptions he had carried about a father he never really knew. He spoke about Gregory Warren, not with hatred but with pity, because any man who spent his life tearing others down must have been broken himself in ways that only he understood. And as he finished his speech, looking out at the faces of people who had gathered to honor a man who died before most of them were born, Jamal shared the lesson that his father's life had taught him across the distance of 20 years and beyond the silence of the grave. The true measure of any person is not what they take from this world, but what they leave behind. And the greatest inheritance any parent can give their child is not money or property, but the example of a life lived with courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that every human being deserves to be treated with dignity.